Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Hypertrophy Past and Present. And today it's kind of like present and present because I'm going to be introducing you guys to another more modern bodybuilding plan, so a golden era plan. I mentioned a few weeks ago that I wanted to start contrasting some of our silver era plans we spent about 6 months now talking about and contrasting them to what we see more in the modern bodybuilding era, sort of golden age and a little bit later. So today I'm going to come at you with a golden era bodybuilding plan. Now, before I do, Chris, how are you doing today?
I'm not too bad, thanks, Jake. I mean, the storm that we had here last night nearly tore the roof off the block of flats that I live in, and it was a pretty unpleasant experience to kind of tidy up after that. But yeah, I mean, I'm in one piece and I'm pretty tired, but yeah, not too bad really.
So a little bit sleep deprived, a little bit catabolic.
Very much sleep deprived. Very much so, yeah.
So I'm going to introduce you guys to a plan from a guy named Ken Waller. Now, some of you will be familiar with Ken because he was actually in the Pumping Iron documentary. So you guys who've seen that, I'm sure, well, some of you will recognize Ken Waller. So Ken Waller won Mr. Universe in 1971, and then he won again in 1974. And then he went on to win the tall division for the Miss Olympia, I think, in 1976. So the plan we're going to talk about today was a routine that he published in 1975. So right when he was in the middle of winning Miss Universes and then about to go compete in the Olympia. Now, Ken is relatively open or has been open about the fact that he did use anabolics. There's no sort of surprises there. And, you know, this is relatively early on in the anabolic era. It's about sort of, a decade or maybe just after a decade or longer than a decade since they sort of would have been widely used in bodybuilding. So I guess what we're seeing here is fairly early stages of how training has changed now that anabolics are more or less the norm. Now, this is quite different to what we've talked about in the past. Obviously, a lot of the silver era plans were full body. They were 3 days a week. This is a 4-day-a-week plan. Now, it's a two-way split. So he had a Monday and a Thursday workout, and he had a Tuesday and a Friday workout. Now, I was trying to work out exactly what this split was, and I couldn't quite work it out. It's almost full body, except the second workout doesn't have quads. But apart from that, it's relatively full body for each day. So I don't know, do with that as you will. But let me describe the two workouts. So this is workout A. So again, repeated twice a week. Now we start with calves. So we've got 8 sets of 15 repetitions of donkey calf raise. Now he concluded those sets with some top partials. Now I think we've seen top partials in a calf exercise before. I forget who it was, but we did discuss this in a silver era plan, perhaps Reg, maybe.
I do remember that, and I don't remember who it was and what the exercise was that they were doing the partials in, though.
It may have even been donkey calf. I feel like it was Reg, and there was a photo I showed you where he had people sitting on his back, and I think we sort of concluded it was probably a method just to make it more challenging based on the limited load availability. But perhaps I'm wrong there. I'm sure there's listeners who are listening and being like, no, it wasn't Reg, it was so-and-so. So I do apologize if I'm incorrect there. You look deep in thought. Shall I move on?
I can't remember. No, I genuinely can't remember what it was, but I do remember that we did have that as an example before. Yeah. Maybe it'll come to me.
Well, you can keep reflecting on that and I'll keep moving on. So the next exercise we have is a barbell squat. Now, again, we've got 7 sets here, actually. So I said 8 sets for the calf, 7 for the squat. Now, the first set was a bit of a warm-up set. So it was a set of 12, but he does specify that this is not taken to failure, like it's not max effort. And then it's descending repetitions. So we go 10, 8, 7, 6, 5, 5. So 2 sets of 5. So after our 7 sets of squats, we go into 5 sets of lying leg curl. Now, what's interesting here, not just for the lying leg curl, but for some of these exercises, is for some of them, he does specify how long to rest between sets. Some of them he doesn't, but some he does. And for lying leg curl, he does say less than 60 seconds. Now, this is, I think, an important shift we see when we start looking at these anabolic plans, is we start seeing rest periods end up getting a lot shorter. Now, after he'd finished his lying leg curls, he sort of concluded his lower body stuff for the day, and then he did a bit of an upper body warm-up, and that consisted of 2 sets of 10 to 15 repetitions of chin-ups and dips. as a superset, so just body weight. And then he went into his first, I guess, working exercise, which was a barbell bench. And this was 5 sets. Again, the first set was a set of 12, which was not taking to failure. He did do like a warm-up set before this, and this was like a half warm-up, half working set. And then a set of 10, 8, 6, 6. Now here he did dress a little bit longer. He did suggest about 1 to 2 minutes. So still relatively short, but not as short as some of these other exercises. And then after the 5 sets of barbell bench, we then have 5 sets of dumbbell incline bench or press. So we've got 5 sets of 8, and this was about 60 to 90 seconds between sets. So fair bit of chest work there, 10 sets. And then we go into wide grip lat pull downs, 5 sets of 8. And this was with less than a minute between sets. And then wide grip bent over barbell row, 5 sets of 8. So we've got 10 sets of chest, 10 sets of back. And then he concludes with a set of chin-ups to failure, so as many reps as possible, body weight, and a set of dips to failure with as many reps as possible. So a fairly monstrous workout A. And then workout B follows a somewhat similar pattern in terms of sets and repetitions. We do start with abs here. So we start with Roman chair sit up, and this is 1 set of as many reps as possible, up to 50. I think he said when you get to 50, you might add some weight or do something to make it harder. And also a bent knee leg raise, so lying flat on the floor, bent knees, bringing your feet towards the ceiling, 1 set of as many as possible. And then a bent over twist. So imagine you've got like I think he suggested using a broomstick. So imagine you've got like a broomstick across your back, like a squat position, and then you're twisting, bringing that broomstick down towards your foot and then twisting to the other side. And this is 1 set of 50 on each side. And then we've got our donkey calf raises again. So he's doing the same calf exercise. And so that was 8 sets with his top partials. And then he does his upper body warm up. So again, same thing, 2 sets of chin ups and dips, supersetted. And then the upper body workout for the day was a standing barbell press. Now this was done with a shoulder width grip. So I guess a bit more kind of sagittal plane. And this was 5 sets, 10, 8, 6, 6, 6. And then 5 sets of behind the neck overhead press. And this was 5 sets of 6. So we've got 10 sets of shoulders there. I do think that the exercise selection is quite interesting, and I'm sure we'll touch on that. And then we've got barbell curls, 5 sets of 8 with 1 minute between sets. And I think this is quite interesting too. He then did 1 arm concentration curls, 5 sets of 8. So, a lot of biceps work here, 10 sets. But what he did specify was to rest about 30 to 60 seconds between arms. So you do 1 arm, 30 seconds, other arm, 30 seconds, other arm, 30 seconds. And I mean, I like that. That's something I actually use in my programs, is just split that rest period between sides. And we can maybe touch on that in a moment. And then he did a barbell triceps extension, 5 sets of 8 with about a minute between sets. 1 arm triceps extension, 5 sets of 8, 8, 8, 6, 6. And then concluded with feet elevated close grip push-ups. So again, I guess more triceps focused. And those 2 sets of as many reps as possible. So all in all, we're looking at, 10-ish direct sets, 10 or 12 direct sets per muscle group, give or take, per workout. And that was at least twice per week. But for some of these muscles, it was in fact, I guess, 4 times a week. And just before I hear your thoughts, I do want to mention one thing. He did actually say that for optimum results, you do want to be doing about 10 to 12 sets per muscle. And this is the bit I want to highlight. He did say that he said that you may have heard people talk about doing fewer sets. So he says that there's an idea that you can only do, or you can get away with only doing 4 or 5 sets per muscle group. And this I thought was quite funny. He said that this is an ancient belief, which, okay, sort of maybe 2 decades old at that point in time. It's a bit more ancient now. But it is interesting to see at that moment in time how this idea of doing, give or take, 4 sets per muscle group per workout, which had been the top end of volume and, relatively normal for people for decades, is now seen as ancient. And now the understanding, the common belief is you need to do 10, 12 sets per muscle per workout. Some fairly big changes, hey?
Yeah, I mean, technically, he's not wrong. I mean, it is ancient in the sense that it is the way that everyone trained from like the ancient Greeks onwards to kind of like the 1960s. But yeah, I can see how it comes across a little bit strange the way he said it. So I don't know where to start, really. I mean, obviously, just reading this is traumatizing. I mean, there's just so much in here. I mean, I don't really see how much of this is going to be very effective.
Well, let's maybe start there. Let's start with what here is quite intuitive or well done, because there are a few things that I think are quite good.
Yeah, the exercise selection, but then arguably he's got everything in the kitchen sink in here.
Yeah, that's fair.
That's kind of sort of cheating. I mean, exercise selection is kind of one of those things where if somebody gets it right and they're only doing a small number of exercises, you're like, that's impressive. Whereas if somebody's got everything in the kitchen sink in a program, you're like, it's not quite so impressive. But you're right. There's a couple of, for example, the back exercises, we've got a wide grip lat pull down, which straight away is, something that we've generally not seen in many of the other earlier programs, and it's cool to see that because it's going to do different, frontal plane pull downs do a fundamentally different thing from sagittal plane pull downs. So that's really interesting to see that. I don't think there is anything explicitly written here as a sagittal plane pull, but there's obviously the wide grip row, which is going to be, very different again.
I mean, he does do chins, which I imagine would be closer
probably
grip.
going to be closer to close grip, aren't they? So, yeah, I mean, from a combination of exercise point of view, you've got 3 really solid back exercises. If you have got a pure sagittal plane shoulder width pull, like a chin up would be, I suppose, and then you've got a wide grip lat pull down, which is very frontal plane, and then you've also got a wide grip row, which is very transverse plane. I think that combination is pretty much covering the back very, very well. You could argue that you'd want a shrug in there, and I don't think he does have a shrug in here, but from a kind of starting from zero, that would be a really good start on a back program. I think you noticed when you're reading through, you made a comment, you noticed that the shoulder, especially the pressing stuff, is quite nicely combined, because you've got the shoulder width press, which we don't often see, which is very, very kind of anterior delt dominant. And then you've got the press behind the neck, which is, again, frontal plane, very middle delt dominant. So that's a really nice combination. So it's kind of achieving the same kind of thing that we've just seen with the back. You're getting that with the shoulders.
And this is one where he didn't throw the kitchen sink at the deltoids. He only really had those 2 direct exercises, and you could argue he really nailed it with those 2.
Definitely. Yeah, that's 2 really nicely kind of combined, or 2 exercises that pair really well together. In terms of chest, I mean, there's not really a lot to say. I mean, he's got a bench press in there, and then he's got an incline press in on top. I think this is an interesting moment just to remind people that the old, not old, but the kind of traditional within the modern bodybuilding kind of sphere of the idea that incline bench is how you target, the clavicular part of the pec. Really, you kind of want a close grip rather than the kind of the incline. The close grip is the sagittal plane version of a bench press is going to do much more for the clavicular pec than an inclined press is going to do if that incline press is done with a wider grip. So
you could combine them, obviously, and do close grip.
Of course, absolutely. You could do a slight incline on your close grip bench, and I mean that'll probably be slightly more effective than just doing it as a flat bench. But it's the plane of motion that matters more than the incline in this particular case. I'm not seeing anything else in there, I don't think, for the pecs, like a pullover or anything. I mean, that's an interesting observation. Pullovers have kind of gone by this point. I mean, I guess, hamstrings, we've just got the leg curl, I think. I don't think there's anything else. No back extensions. There's not actually any hinging either, is there?
No, I mean, obviously we've got the bent over row if you want to put any sort of isometric.
The way some people do it, it definitely looks like a hip hinge, doesn't it? I mean, but yeah, I mean, and there's a lot of fluff in here with the kind of the ab work, which isn't doing anything at 50 reps. I mean,
adding a bit of fatigue before you get stuck into upper body work, I guess.
We'd describe as a very light load. I mean, this is probably something we're going to come back to in a future episode when we talk about the interactions between anabolics and training programs. but you can at least here see there is a emphasis on cardiovascular strain. So he is, as you say, putting in exercise at the beginning. He's got his pull-ups and his press-ups in done before he starts his upper body workout. He's got high rep ab work in before he starts his other workout. And there's a lot of short rest periods for pretty much all of the exercises that he's doing. A lot of it is going to create a very large amount of cardiovascular activity. He's going to be breathing hard throughout most of these sessions. As a result, he's going to hit muscular failure. I mean, people don't understand what muscular failure is. Let me just specify. So when we say muscular failure, we mean the point, it's task failure. It's just that hypertrophy researchers don't read fatigue research, so they don't realize there was already a term existing. So they kind of invented one. Which they didn't need to do. But muscular failure just means that you hit a point at the end of a strength training set where you can't do another repetition. Or task failure is that exact same definition in the context of the fatigue literature. The point is that if you have a cardiovascular sensation going on, you're going to be closer to your maximum tolerable perception of effort for the same level of motor unit recruitment. So you're actually going to have lower recruitment on most of the sets in this workout simply because of that cardiovascular activity going on in the background. And what's really interesting is that, you do see some of the bodybuilders who are, kind of famous for having competed at the highest level, commenting on this issue. They do often say, oh, well, you don't want to get to a point where your cardiovascular system is causing you to reach failure. There's a couple of famous examples of people making that statement. But nevertheless, it does seem to be a fairly common theme for that to happen. And this is a great program to illustrate that point. And I think those of you who are listening to this and are kind of have a mindset that likes to unravel problems might like to start pulling on that thread and seeing where you get to is why did we start, or why did they start to introduce that element into workouts at this point? Is it just because they were doing so much volume they needed to fit it in and didn't want to still be there at tea time? Is it just simply the amount of work that needs to get done that causes these rest periods to get shorter? But then how does that square with doing extra kind of high rep stuff before you start? That starts to make things a little bit confusing. It does feel like they are chasing this cardiovascular sensation rather than just incorporating it in order to get more work done in less time.
Yeah, that's an interesting observation, and potentially we'll talk about that in sort of coming episodes. But I'm starting to change my belief, I guess, on some of these steroid era plans, where initially when I saw them, I thought, I don't know that these people necessarily knew what they were doing. Like initially I'll look at it and be like, look, this isn't effective. I think there's a lot of, ambiguity that's sort of been baked in with the use of anabolics that has disconnected their ability to kind of understand what is and isn't working. And I think we're just seeing, everything thrown at it and people aren't able to intuit what's effective. And now I look at it and I'm like, you know what? I actually think even if they didn't cognitively necessarily know why they've gone down some of these paths, I actually think that it evolved in a way that makes sense based on the unique profile we see that anabolics present. And I think it's interesting, like you just said there, why might they have started with some of this cardiovascularly demanding stuff? Why might they be doing lots of sets of short rest periods? And I don't think it's just by chance. I think this stuff stuck because it met a particular need, and whether they knew what that need was, I guess directly or not, I think that it actually was, it did function for a particular purpose.
Yeah, I can see where you're coming from on that. I think I'm probably still slightly behind that point of view. I'm not all the way there. I think that, and I definitely think there is a better way of doing what they're trying to do.
Yes.
But I can see the direction that you're going in. I can see why you think that. But as I say, I do think there are probably easier and more effective and probably safer ways of achieving the same thing. And I also have as you know, we often joke about this, I have a more skeptical viewpoint on many things, and cynical even, some would say. And I do think there's a little bit of performative aspect to some of this stuff, where it's kind of designed to look like something that it isn't. And I think that's, again, something we can come back and talk about in a future conversation. But yeah, I mean, just in terms of this program, to kind of summarize my thoughts on it, like you've kind of pointed out, there's some really nice exercise selection in here, nevertheless, despite the craziness of the volumes. Really, really good exercise selection in there, but some really fascinating features, I would say. The most fascinating thing about this program is just how much it tells us about, like you were saying, the specific needs of the bodybuilders of this time in response to the problems, perhaps, or the kind of issues that they were facing. And it really just comes down to this enormous amount of cardiovascular kind of activity they're going to be generating by using these short rest periods, high volumes, and dumping in large numbers of high rep body weight stuff all over the place, apparently.
It's bookending both at the start and the end.
Beginning, middle, and the middle and the end. It's like
in the middle as well.
Stick it in all over the place. You're kind of like, why is that even there? And anyway, so just really, really interesting to see this. And I think it's going to be hopefully a lot clearer to people why it might be there when we come back and follow up on this in a future episode.
Now, one final comment I want to make, or even question for you. So obviously people will hear this and like, 10 sets of chest and 5 sets of that exercise and 8 sets of this exercise. And obviously we talk a lot about recoverable volume and higher sets, obviously causing a longer post-workout recovery period due to the muscle damage that volume is causing. Now, obviously, these are high volumes, but what you've mentioned there with this body weight stuff at the start, which is causing some underlying fatigue, these short rest periods, and, just this sort of, I guess those two things combined, this high cardiovascular demand of the workout, ultimately, those sets are going to be less damaging than they would be otherwise in a more quote unquote normal workout program where someone wasn't doing all of this cardiovascular demanding work. Yeah.
Exactly. So very simply, what we're describing here is a psychobiological model of fatigue. So the brain, when it tries to recruit motor units, is going to produce central motor command to do that. It's also going to produce a corollary discharge that we recognize as perception effort. If we haven't got any other sources of effort, then what happens is we increase that central motor command to the point where it matches our maximum tolerable perception effort, or the corollary discharge reaches our maximum tolerable perception effort. And that is a perfect scenario where we've got maximum levels of recruitment that are theoretically possible. Now, if you have another source of discomfort, and in this case, we're seeing a pretty large one, which is the cardiovascular activity, what's going to happen is that cardiovascular activity is going to be recognized as, the burning sensations in the lungs and the elevated heart rate and all of those things. And that brings us closer to the maximum tolerable perception of effort, but not from the corollary discharge. It's now coming from something that isn't producing recruitment. And as a result, we end up with a lower recruitment level at muscular failure. This is something that a lot of hypertrophy researchers still struggle with, and a lot of fitness influencers really don't get at all. It's just that you can reach muscular failure without hitting maximum levels of recruitment, even for your normal levels of recruitment. I'm not talking about voluntary activation deficits at the moment. So ultimately, if you have all of these kind of short rest periods, you have the high rep body weight stuff at the beginning, when you're doing a lot of volume, you are going to be ultimately not hitting very high levels of recruitment. And that means that you're not going to be creating damage in the muscle fibers at the top end of the motor unit pool, which are the ones that are most susceptible to damage. So I think, again, what's interesting about this workout plan is that if you don't have the rest period information, or you ignore the high rep body weight stuff and its effect, you might go, 10 sets twice a week for a body part, or even more than that. Some of them are being trained 4 times a week. You just go, this is totally impossible. But actually, when you kind of realize it's closer to being a kind of a more of an anaerobic type cardiovascular workout rather than a strength training workout, it starts to look a little bit less offensive.
Now, there's a trade-off, because you're not just reducing damage, you're also reducing the stimulus of each one of those sets.
Exactly. So the stimulus isn't happening. So again, this kind of plays perfectly into the hands of those of us who would argue that anabolics are doing most of the hypertrophy work. So this brings us to our topic for today, which is weekly net stimulus. Well, it's kind of a quick walk through a couple of issues, starting with weekly net stimulus, because ultimately last week, so if you haven't listened to our podcast from last week, please go and do that, because what I'm about to say won't make any sense otherwise. It ties into what we said last time. So weekly net stimulus is a model that I built that comprises 3 separate elements, and it's designed to allow you to compare different training programs that have different volume frequency combinations. So essentially, if you're interested in comparing a program with another program to see whether the other program would be better, you can just put both programs' assumptions into a calculator. Now there is one that you can use, or you can calculate in Excel yourself if you want to, and it'll give you the answer of which of the programs is better. Now, it has 3 assumptions built in, but it also has a limit that tells you whether or not you can put the numbers in, whether it's going to make sense or not. So the 3 assumptions essentially relate to the workout dose response. So how much hypertrophy does each extra set create in a workout? Now, there are issues associated with the data sets that we've got there, because they kind of violate the principle that we've just been talking about, which is that they don't really recognize the rest period duration. So the dose response data we've got kind of just drop everything into a hopper and pump out the answer at the end. If you're using longer rest periods, you're probably going to find that your dose response curve is a little bit steeper at the beginning in comparison with somebody who's using using shorter rest periods. Their dose response curve is going to be a lot more stretched out, and it may actually be reach a lower point as well as a result of the kind of accumulated CNS fatigue. So essentially, we start with the workout dose response, and that's the most fundamental observation about that is it's non-linear. So essentially, each extra set you do isn't going to be as effective as the previous one, which straight away kind of anybody who has any kind of mathematical inclination whatsoever is going to say straight away, oh, well, that means that higher frequency training is going to be better than lower frequency training. It's really interesting talking with people who are engineers or have a math background or even a science background that doesn't relate to exercise science, because as soon as you introduce the concept of a non-linear dose response of a workout, they go, oh, right, okay, so I need to train more times per week so I get more earlier sets in the workout. Yeah, that's exactly how you want to train. And they don't have that hang-up that hypertrophy researchers have, which is they've got this thing in their brain that tells them that they can't say that. So they miss the obvious kind of math implications. The second observation is that whenever we are not growing muscle, we are obviously losing muscle. And this is the atrophy effect that we see. And the maintenance literature give us this kind of assumption. So maintenance literature, there's 3 or 4 studies out there. They all show exactly the same thing, which is that if you do 3 or 4 sets once per week, you don't grow. Even if you run that study for 6 months, you don't grow. So this is one of those interesting areas of research that nobody wants to talk about, because as soon as you talk about it, you realize that atrophy is happening inside of a training week, and a lot of people don't want to accept that. So just a minor point on the side about this. I lose track of the number of times people ask me to respond to nonsense that they've seen online. So all the time people are messaging me saying, X person on Instagram or TikTok or whatever came up with this ludicrous idea. I want you to tell me why it's not true. I'm like, why? I mean, why are you asking me to respond to that nonsense? I mean, it's like there's no reason that anyone would believe that. And yet, conversely, nobody will respond to my point on the maintenance literature. Nobody wants to talk about it. The reason they don't want to talk about it is because it definitively shows us that we have got a atrophy effect happening inside of a training week, and there's nothing that you can do to argue against it. So all the studies, as I say, show pretty much the same thing. 3 or 4 sets once per week means that you must have a hypertrophy stimulus being produced by that 3 or 4 set workout. And by the time you get to the end of the week, the back end of that week, you've seen atrophy occurring in those days towards the end of the week. And that's the assumption number 2. And then the assumption number 3, which relates to what we talked about last week, is the duration of the stimulus period. So when we just think about that maintenance literature, as I say, you've got a 3 or 4 set workout which produces some stimulus, and then you process that stimulus, and then when the stimulus period ends, you then go into an atrophy period where you lose all of that stimulus. Well, how long is that stimulus period? Now, a lot of people have wanted to use the duration of the post-workout myofibrillar protein synthesis rate elevation to do that. Now, you can and you can't. So You can, in the sense that if you've got a study that shows that your stimulus period comes back. Sorry, if you've got a study that shows that your myofibrillar protein synthesis rate elevation comes back down to 0, as in baseline, that is useful, because essentially you're telling us, or you're seeing, that there can't be any hypertrophy stimulus past that point where it comes back down to baseline. Alternatively, if you have a hypertrophy, if you're looking for a hypertrophy stimulus period answer, and you've got a MYOPS or an MPS rate elevation that spills out for 3 or 4 days, that doesn't necessarily mean that your stimulus period lasts 3 or 4 days, because we know that damage is delayed and can also elevate MYOPS, as we talked about in last week's conversation. So on the one hand, if you've got a relatively short MPS period and it comes back down to baseline, and you're fairly confident that you therefore don't have much, if any, damage at all, then you can be relatively confident that that does represent your hypertrophy stimulus period in that situation. You can't, if you've done a reasonably chunky workout of quite a few sets or something else that creates a lot of damage, and you've spilled out over 3 or 4 days, and it's like, that isn't telling you that you've got a hypertrophy stimulus period, because your MPS could be elevated by damage and you can atrophy while you're experiencing damage. Just look at the traumatic injury literature. So, I think there's a really kind of important observation to be made there, is that MPS studies don't always give you the answer for how long your stimulus period is if you have a muscle damage component to that. But ultimately, stimulus period is just going to tell you what your atrophy rate is per day. It doesn't really tell you necessarily what your atrophy rate looks like per week, because if you look at the maintenance studies, you've got, say, if you imagine your stimulus period is 2 days, then essentially what you do is you go, well, I'm losing 4 sets worth of hypertrophy from my 4-set workout on Monday. I'm losing that across 5 days. If you make your stimulus period 3 days, you now have to lose that over 4 days instead of 5 days. You're getting a faster rate of atrophy per day if your MYOPS, kind of duration that you're thinking is your stimulus period is longer rather than shorter. So the reality is, when people start messing around with stimulus periods, which you can do actually in the calculator for the weekly net stimulus model, they don't realize that you're robbing Peter to pay Paul. Mm-hmm. If you have an atrophy, which is 3 or 4 sets worth of atrophy stimulus, you're losing that per week. How you allocate that over 4 days or 5 days, or however many days you allocate over, that is going to kind of, change both in one direction and in the other direction. So, even though you've got a longer stimulus period, you've now got a faster rate of atrophy per day as a result of doing that. So a lot of people don't realize that's how the model works, but that's how it works. So ultimately, an important thing about the weekly net stimulus model is we've just got those 3 basic assumptions. And then the limit is just, how many sets can you actually get away with? So this is kind of what we were just talking about with the golden era plan that you brought us today. It's like, can I do 10 sets twice a week? Well, no, the calculator won't let you put that data in, because it'll just go, well, that's not going to be recoverable. You've kind of got to stick with the, sort of 2 or 3 sets recoverable in 48 hours, 4 or 5 sets recoverable in 72 hours. And, you can kind of go up higher than that, but then you're sort of into kind of bro split territory, and not many people are using that anymore. I think most people are either fighting it out over full body every other day or upper lower splits still, which I think is really not a very good way of training. But so essentially that's a reminder of how the weekly net stimulus model is working, and just connecting it back to what we described last time regarding MYOPS and MPS rates, and the fact that those MPS rates do not guarantee you're in a hypertrophic state, because they are used for other stuff as well as for simply adding myofibrillar proteins to individual muscle fibers.
So, look, that's a fairly straightforward and relatively simple explanation of how the model works. And like you said, there's a calculator that people can access, and you can quite easily plug in your own data, like what you're following, how many sets you're doing, etc. And you can actually manipulate the maintenance volume. So whether you think, and I'm aware that maybe a user who's going to this website for the first time may not know, should they select 3 sets, should they select 4 sets for maintenance, should they select 2 days for MYOPS, should they select 40, what are the other options, 72 hours or whatever the options are that the calculator gives you.
Yeah, I think there's a note that says if you don't know what you're doing, then you should select 3 sets for maintenance, 48 hours for the stimulus period. I think that's I think that's everything. Oh, and
and
the
the
Schoenfeld
volume.
data set. The
Yeah.
Schoenfeld data set for the dose response. People ask me a lot, actually, why I choose the Schoenfeld instead of the Pelland, given that the Pelland is more recent. The reason I select the Schoenfeld over the Pelland is because Pelland is more recent. That's literally the reason I don't like it. It's because in the space of time between the Schoenfeld meta-analysis was published and the Pelland meta-analysis was published, a lot of volume tier studies got done, which were very high volumes, and the risk of muscle swelling interfering with the hypertrophy results in those situations is extremely high as a result of that large number of high volume studies being done between the Schoenfeld and the Pelland meta-analyses. So it's not a comment on the Pelland meta-analysis or the quality thereof. It's literally a comment on the existence of the studies that have been done between those two dates, and that's why I always like the Schoenfeld better.
Yeah. So if you're looking at that, you're like, well, I don't know which one's better or what to use or whatever. Like you said, there's a default option which it sort of guides you through. Now, as long as you stick to these sort of parameters, it's relatively easy or straightforward to use, and you can plug in whatever split you want. You can play with different workouts, and you can play with the different, you can use Schoenfeld or you can use Pelland and see how they differ. You can change the variables of whatever maintenance volume or whatever, and you can see, okay, how does this actually influence the outcome? But there's a few other ways that the calculator, I guess, could be misused, or someone could incorrectly try to apply it and maybe get the wrong information out of it. And one of those ways is perhaps looking at a workout or looking at exercises and not knowing which muscle of these exercises actually applicable for or providing stimulus to. And so that would be an easy way for someone to look at it and be like, well, I don't know. Do I count if I'm doing bench, do I count that for triceps and for chest and for shoulders, or do I just count, a direct sort of bias exercise for that muscle? Or how do people deal with that question?
So ultimately, we've got to start with what the physiologically correct answer is, and then kind of work backwards from that to find the practical point that you're happy operating at. And the practical point that you're happy operating at is going to differ according to your goals and according to what your sort of tolerance is for ambiguity. So if we start by just describing what the physiologically correct answer is, and then eventually work backwards to what the practically kind of sensible or practically appropriate answer is for each person. I think that'll take quite a while to get to that point, but let's do the physiologically correct one first and work backwards. So really what this comes back to is, what is actually happening on an exercise by exercise basis, or a muscle region, or even a muscle fiber by muscle fiber basis, in the context of the weekly net stimulus model, in the context of a strength training program. So essentially, the fundamental principle behind my entire stimulating reps model is that hypertrophy and therefore atrophy are muscle fiber specific. So you can't stimulate a muscle to grow. This is really the great kind of delusion that 99% of the fitness industry has, that they can train a muscle. You can't train a muscle. It's muscle fibers that you're training. So if a muscle fiber is not activated, it isn't going to experience transverse hypertrophy. Yes, you can stretch it. You can create passive tension. Yes, you can produce some sarcomerigenesis. You cannot produce myofibrillar addition in a fiber unless you've activated it. I feel like I should say that 3 more times because it doesn't seem like it makes any difference. I say it 100 times and people still run around claiming that you can train a muscle, or they sneak around it and go, oh, well, no, but I'm not training that muscle fiber, but I'm still stopping it from atrophying. No, you can't say that. It's the same thing. Atrophy, hypertrophy are literally just opposite sides of the same coin. You're either training it and it's growing, or you're not training it and it's shrinking. That's it. There is no other scenario. So it's literally, we're dealing with hypertrophy on a fiber by fiber basis. So ultimately, every exercise that you do, even if it's training a similar region of the body, is going to train very slightly different numbers and groups of muscle fibers in that area. Now, let me start from the very beginning and explain why that's true. So I'm going to walk through this relatively slowly. So in any strength training or any force production movement that we do with a high level of effort, or even a maximal effort, there is still what we call a voluntary activation deficit. Now, these voluntary activation deficits are calculated in dynamometer machines. So a sports scientist will get people to sit in an apparatus and they'll get strapped in so they've got maximum stability, and they'll use a very small amount of muscle mass, like a single limb, to do knee extension or elbow flexion, something like that. And the person will produce a maximal effort in an isometric, highly stable, low muscle mass situation. And even then, with all those advantages, all that stability, all that minimal amount of muscle mass, all that kind of setup, you still notice that there is some muscle fibers not being activated. How do we know that? We know that because of the way the voluntary activation measurement works. Voluntary activation measurement is not electromyography. It's a comparison of forces. So what they do is that you measure the voluntary force output, and then you put an electrical twitch onto the muscle as it is producing a maximal effort. If you get any kind of response there, then what you're finding is that, of course, there were muscle fibers that weren't activated in the, the kind of in the situation that was being in which voluntary force was being generated. So essentially, the addition of extra bit of force with the electrical stimulation is telling you that there are fibers in that area that previously weren't being used. Now, ultimately, in large muscles like the glutes and the quadriceps, in those situations, we're seeing 10 to 15% deficits. Okay, so 10 to 15% extra force production is being, not happening voluntarily despite a maximum level of effort. Now, I just want to clarify one further thing before I contrast that with what's happening in a strength training exercise. When we do a voluntary activation deficit test, as I say, we're measuring, we're trying to establish the number of fibers that are not being activated in a situation. It's underestimating that quite a lot. And the reason it's underestimating it is because the only fibers that will add torque to the dynamometer measurement are those that have leverage. Okay? So imagine that you're doing something like a glute medius exercise, because this is the best example. I know it's unfortunate that it's not a muscle we tend to think of in bodybuilding, but it's a really, really good example. Imagine you're doing a glute medius exercise and you get a voluntary activation deficit of, I don't think it's ever been measured, but let's say like 8% or something like that, because it's a big muscle, but it's not as big as something like the quadriceps or the glute. So you've got a chunky kind of glute medius muscle, maybe it's got an 7 or 8% deficit, and you measure that and you go, that's interesting. So 7 or 8% of the muscle fibers in the entire muscle are not being activated in this maximum hip abduction exercise. Well, it might be a lot more than that, because the glute medius has very, very distinct segments as it wraps around the hip, and some of the fibers right at the very anterior portion probably aren't very good at hip abduction. They're probably really mostly good at hip internal rotation. Conversely, the ones at the back, much more external rotators, not really very good at hip abduction. Do the same thing with the pec when you're thinking about different planes of motion. But ultimately, if you were kind of to say to me, well, we've got a 7% activation deficit, therefore 7% of the fibers in the glute medius are not being activated, I would turn around and go, well, what about the ones that don't have leverage? So your activation test can't measure that, because the way it tests for the deficit is to see how much extra force we add on, torque we add on when those fibers are electrically stimulated. And if you stimulate them and they don't produce any torque, they're not going to add to the measurement. So straight away, what people don't understand is that voluntary activation deficit measurements already underestimate, even in the perfect scenario, already underestimate the amount of fibers that are not being activated, because they ignore fibers. The literal way the test works ignores fibers that don't have leverage for the specific action you're doing. And if the muscle has the ability to do multiple things, you are going to have fibers in that scenario which just can't add force in the test that you're doing.
Yeah. Is that a problem that will affect all muscles? There'll be some muscles that will be more affected than others. Obviously, you gave an example there, but are there some muscles that off the top of your head you think probably wouldn't be too impacted by that?
Yeah, quadriceps. When you've got a muscle that's just super vanilla, that really just does one thing, you're going to find that probably isn't much of a deal. You could probably argue that there's different joint angle ranges of motion in which different parts of the quadriceps will have better leverage than others, but ultimately they're all just doing knee extension. There's nothing else going on. The thing is, if a muscle has the ability to do more than one thing, then you're going to probably have that issue. A lot of people point at the biceps and go, oh, well, elbow flexors, they just kind of do this one thing. I'm like, no, not really. There's some really nice data showing that if you do supination, you get a very different pattern of muscle activation from if you do elbow flexion. Now, you can't really pin that down to one particular place across all the people that you're testing. It tends to vary between people where that activation pattern varies, but you do definitely see very different patterns of activation according to whether you're doing supination versus elbow flexion. So I think ultimately any muscle that's capable of doing more than one thing, like we talked about the glute medius, my favorite example, elbow flexors generally, that's another nice example, biceps specifically. Ultimately, the more vanilla things like maybe the triceps, the quadriceps, you're probably going to find that doesn't really apply, but it will absolutely apply in anything that can do multiple things.
Okay, so some of those muscles obviously have quite large voluntary activation deficits, even if we ignore the fact that there's some muscle fibers that aren't going to be, detected.
So you'd expect those deficits would be even bigger if we were able to incorporate that extra information regarding fibers that can't produce torque in the context of the test. So I'm saying that in the context of dynamometry, we are underestimating how big that effect is. So it's going to be bigger than the 10%, 15% that we see for the quads and the glutes in those bigger muscles. It tends to get smaller and smaller with a smaller muscle. Biceps is probably the smallest muscle that we still see a voluntary activation deficit in very clearly, but it's pretty much the smallest muscle that we train anyway in bodybuilding. So,
now a question on that. So say we detect, let's say, a 10% voluntary activation deficit. Now, you've kind of given us the answer there, but let's just make it a bit more explicit. So does that mean that those 10% of those muscle fibers, they're never being used? Like, is it always the same 10% and we just aren't able to access those top 10%? Or what's it mean?
Well, that's the issue. So it's always going to be about that kind of number of fibers that don't get used, but the precise exercise that you do is going to change which fibers they are. So essentially, that's the issue that we're facing here. So if I do a maximal effort biceps curl, I'm going to get probably a deficit of, and I'm describing this in the context of a dynamometer. I'm going to come on and talk about strength training situation, why it's slightly different in a minute. But in the context of a dynamometer, if I do a maximal effort elbow flexion in a dynamometer, I'm going to get, say, a voluntary activation deficit of 3 or 4%, maybe, not very much at all, say 3%, which is great. And it's, say, 3% of the fibers I'm not activating. If I now did a maximal effort supination instead, then I would, again, probably have a deficit of about 3%. Maybe a bit less because I'm probably not using as much of the elbow flex complex. So I might get it down to 1 or 2%, but it would be different fibers that were in that 1 or 2% deficit in comparison with the ones that were in the deficit previously, because I'm doing a fundamentally different motion. And according to neuromechanical matching, I'm going to preferentially activate fibers that are good at the thing that I want to do. I mean, it's like, I always just find it staggering when people would say, oh, neuromechanical matching doesn't apply. And I'm like, how can it not? It's like, all I'm saying is that, all neuromechanical matching is saying is that the body is going to prefer to use muscle fibers that do the thing that you want to do. It's like, what are you suggesting? That we use the glute to do like elbow flexion or something? I mean, it's like, you just kind of reduce these people's arguments to the most absurd level, and they see that it just can't possibly be anything other than neuromechanical matching. But anyway, ultimately, neuromechanical matching tells us that we are going to prefer to activate the fibers earlier if they are better at the thing that we want them to do. So you end up with your deficit in the case of elbow flexion being one set of muscle fibers that are probably really good at supination and not very good at elbow flexion. In contrast to you doing supination, you can end up with a load of fibers that are, being activated because they're good at supination. You're not going to end up with very many fibers that are purely good at elbow flexion being activated very early. Therefore, they're going to be in the deficit section at the top end of the motor unit pool.
There's an interesting implication there, because if you think about that example of the biceps brachii, so let's say there was a 4% voluntary activation deficit of just an elbow flexion exercise. Now, if someone only ever did that exercise and that deficit got smaller, then essentially it should be the same muscle fibers that they haven't been able to access. And if that deficit gets smaller, they're now accessing more of those kind of top end muscle fibers in the top end motor units. Yeah. Now, if they changed exercises, like you just said there, actually that differs. Now it's not about accessing motor units we haven't had access to before. Now it's about a change in leverages. Yeah. So there's two ways, I guess, that we can rotate or access different motor units.
Oh yeah, totally. I mean, over time, you can increase your motor unit accruement levels and reduce your deficits, and in smaller muscles, maybe you can get most of the way there. But the bigger muscles are not going to let you get all the way there. They're just not going to be really feasible. And this is before we talk about how strength training movements differ from dynamometry. But yeah, I mean, ultimately, what we're seeing here is the importance of exercise selection in determining, which of the fibers are getting left out of the running when it comes to producing maximal efforts, as I say, in those highly stable dynamometry tests with low levels of muscle mass being involved. So what I wanted to kind of now clarify is that when you go from dynamometry testing, which is where all these voluntary activation calculations are done, when you then move across to strength training exercises, you experience at least two quite important disadvantages. Firstly, we're going from a situation where we are not having the same degree of stability. So whereas we're strapped in a dynamometer with maximum stability, we lose all that benefit. We go to an unstable scenario or less stable scenario. Stability affects motor unit accruement on a sliding scale. So as you go away from the highly stable dynamometry situations, you start to lose that stability. Your voluntary activation deficit is going to get bigger. You're going to lose motor unit accruement. Similarly, if you incorporate two limbs instead of one limb, straight away bilateral force deficit underpinned by voluntary activation differences, you're going to lose some more voluntary activation. You're going to get a bigger deficit. And if you incorporate multi-joint exercise on top of that, you've now got a really big voluntary activation deficit compared to the one that you had in your dynamometry test. So when people say, oh, well, I can do a, sort of barbell overhead press and I'm going to be activating all of the prime movers maximally, I'm like, in what planet are you living on? There's like no physiological reason why you would ever make that statement unless you'd literally not done any of the reading. It's really obvious that if you go from a dynamometry situation with a highly stable setup, isometric, so you're not worrying about any coordination issues at all, you're not worrying about any stability issues at all, a low level of muscle mass, and now you try and extrapolate that voluntary activation deficit to a overhead press with an unstable implement with multiple muscles working at the same time, it's just going to be way bigger. The deficit's going to be way bigger. So ultimately, we're going to experience a much bigger issue in those exercises that we're using in the gym as a matter of course, in comparison with what we're seeing in dynamometry. So not only is dynamometry itself underestimating how many muscle fibers we're leaving on the table because of the nature of the way that the test is calculated, like I was explaining earlier, but if we don't remember to do an adjustment for the lack of stability, the coordination issues associated with dynamic movements, and of course the larger amounts of muscle mass that we're using, if we don't adjust for those again, we're going to think our voluntary activation deficits are much smaller than they actually are. They're massive. People don't realize just how big voluntary activation deficits are. So that really just underscores that when we use a different exercise, we're probably getting a very different set of muscle fibers being used, especially at the top end of the motor unit pool, if we're using that muscle or muscle group to do slightly different things, as in it could be training a different range of motion, it could be a different plane of motion. A lot of people forget that one. I mean, there was an argument online just the other day, people were going, oh, well, a frontal plane and a sagittal plane pull down are doing the same thing. I'm like, it's just like, in what world are you living? They're doing very different things because the lat has very different leverages regionally, whether it's frontal or sagittal, and you start using the frontal plane movement and you get mainly lumbar activation because by the time you've used all of that up, you haven't got a lot of capacity to use much of your thoracic region because your voluntary activation deficit kicks in. So how are you going to get all that activation of the thoracic region when you've already, maxed out the lumbar region with the frontal plane exercise? You just can't do that. Voluntary activation deficits won't let you achieve that. So this is ultimately telling us that when we've got a set of exercises in our training program, we can't just say, oh, I'm going to train hamstrings on Monday with the leg curl, the seated leg curl. I'm going to hamstrings on Wednesday with the lying leg curl. I'm going to train hamstrings on Friday with the, 45-degree back extension, and somehow I'm expecting to treat that as just hamstrings exercises, and they're all doing the same thing, and I'm expecting the weekly net stimulus model to just treat those as completely identical, things for the purposes of hamstrings muscle stimulus. And it's like, physiologically, that's not what's happening. Yes, there will be a chunk of muscle fibers at the bottom end of the motor unit pool and middle of the motor unit pool in the kind of the two joint hamstrings muscles that does apply to. But as you go up to the top end of the motor unit pool and you start talking about the single joint hamstrings, it's no longer applicable. So ultimately, in true physiological terms, the weekly net stimulus model actually applies on a muscle fiber by muscle fiber basis, because hypertrophy and atrophy are muscle fiber specific. And I could just, again, say that 100 times. People just carry on ignoring me. But, that is just physiologically how hypertrophy works. You can't hypertrophy one fiber and expect another fiber to pay any attention to that. It's just not going to.
So the best way to use a calculator would actually be per exercise, in a sense. I mean, obviously there's going to be some issue there.
Well, you get overlap. Yeah. I mean, the perfect scenario would be if you were only doing one exercise for a specific muscle region or muscle group, then you could kind of do that. But this is the issue. Physiology is messy in the way that we're trying to map our strength training onto the physiology. And I think this is interesting to speculate. Why have many in the science-based lifting community started to go down the route of using, single limb, single joint, highly specific exercises? Because it actually fits the physiology, and there's a whole bunch of people who are more historically minded who are, kind of railing against that and getting upset about it because they don't like the way that is going in a direction that is different from theirs. But you can see why they're doing it, because they're trying to go, how do I map what I'm doing practically closer to the physiological reality? Now, you may end up in a situation where you go, actually, I don't like it. It's not practical. It doesn't work for me. Fine, no problem. But you've accepted that the reality is the way it works, and you've now made compromises. Yeah. I've made compromises in the way I train. I mean, I do that all the time. But it's interesting just to see when you've got a group of people who have got a lot of, youth and energy on their side, that they're experimenting in ways that actually do start to fit with the physiology in a better way.
Yeah. Yeah. And it is, like you said, it's messy, because then there's other, I guess, layers to put on top of that as well. Like you said, accessibility or time-wise, or, for me, I was doing an exercise yesterday in my home gym. I was doing an overhead press in a sagittal plane, but I was using like a neutral grip bar. And so it's too short to put on a rack on hooks. So I was doing it standing. And I was thinking to myself, I'm not going to film this exercise, because I put it up, I'm going to get people saying, why are you doing it standing? You're so much less stable. But the payoff or the trade-off, if I was to do it seated and try to leverage that weight up, that would be way worse for me, right? So there's always going to be sort of other, not just compromises, but other components in the real world that's going to affect some of this as well.
Totally. So where we end up then is physiologically, the weekly net stimulus model is really thinking about muscle fibers. And the way we can kind of translate that to reality is by saying, well, it's going to be, regions that are thickly directed at certain tasks, like I was explaining with biceps doing supination, or biceps doing elbow flexion, or lats doing frontal plane versus sagittal plane. So you can kind of break it down into functional regions, if you like. I could probably market a course based on that idea. It's like all kinds of silly things floating around. But you basically talk about functional regions, sort of backtracking on that nomenclature already. But you can kind of sort of see that there's like a particular purpose of certain muscle fibers that are doing, and some are extremely specialized and are only really going to be activated in certain scenarios, and others can be much less specialized and kind of okay at a bunch of things. And so you'll see those kind of behaving in slightly different ways. But ultimately, from a practical point of view, yeah, you can kind of go down the science-based lifting approach and really try and isolate not strictly isolate, but really target preferentially certain specific regions by making the task as specific as possible. I just want to make a quick comment on the supination thing, because I can guarantee you that as soon as someone hears this podcast, they'll go, oh, so you're saying that when I do biceps curls, I should include supination as I do the curl? I'm like, no. Because unless you've got a really weird shaped dumbbell, your supination is not going to be anywhere close to maximal effort.
Which Arnold apparently used to use offset dumbbells. Now, I don't know.
If you've got a really weird offset type dumbbell and you can make it so that the supination action is just as hard as the elbow flexion
that's the thing. You would need to match it. It would be quite difficult to get that.
You can do that. Much easier is to do a normal elbow flexion exercise and then get like a small sledgehammer and just do rotations with the wrist with your small sledgehammer. It doesn't actually, because the leverage can be really long. You don't need a massive, great big.
You can just, I normally just use an empty bar. Like if you got like a lat pull down bar, and then you can just adjust where you hold it.
Sledgehammers with wooden handles are really comfortable for this. So grip
it's made to be held in that way, yeah.
They're made to be held. So whereas a barbell is really uncomfortable. When you start really squeezing it, it becomes really uncomfortable. Whereas a sledge is really comfortable. Sits in the hand. You can do those grip wrist kind of rotations.
There's people who are doing this exercise using cables as well. Yo's obviously posted some videos doing it like that.
Yeah,
I've not tried it out that way, but presumably it would work.
Personally, I find cables uncomfortable to do that, but then I'm kind of fussy and old and all that kind of thing. So, but yeah, I mean, if people can make it work, fantastic. But yeah, I mean, the point I'm making here is just simply to say that, no, I'm not suggesting that we start doing, kind of dumbbell curls starting in a pronated position and rotating through to supination, because that isn't going to do anything. Because you're not, unless you've got a really weird shaped dumbbell, you're not going to be able to get high level of force effort in the supination direction. It's just waving your hands around while you're doing the curl. It's not actually achieving what. It's the same thing that people think about when I say, oh, we're going to talk about eccentric training, and they go, oh, so you're saying we should slow down the lowering phase? And I'm like, just stop talking.
It's not doing what you think. Yeah.
It's not doing what you think it's doing.
You're using the words. You're using the words, but in practice, that's not. Yeah. Yeah.
There's a famous. I think it's Scott Adams actually who came up with that. He says you've got to watch out for word thinkers. They think that words have meanings outside of the concepts that they're describing, and that's just not how reality works. You can't take the words. So, I mean, I'm seeing this in neuromechanical matching a lot at the moment, and I will do some videos about this soon, but a lot of people have taken the words around neuromechanical matching and they've kind of said, oh, so this means that. I'm like, no, you're doing a word thinking exercise. Like the concepts beneath those words are what you need to be addressing, not the words themselves. If you're just addressing the words themselves, you're not interacting with the argument. You're just trying to score points. That other people who don't understand the issue might be persuaded by. You've got to actually address the concepts that the words are describing, and currently you're not doing that. But yeah, word thinking is always an issue, and it happens with eccentric phases. It happens with things like, kind of this supination issue you're describing. It happens in other situations.
And this is not you saying that there's nothing happening with supination, because again, there is value to doing supination or pronation, and that's going to potentially bias different parts of the elbow flexor complex. But you're not getting those fibers that might specifically.
But what we're saying there is that you're starting in a supinated position or in a pronated position. You're holding it in that position because that changes the leverages that the muscles have for elbow flexion. But I'm also saying on top of that is that you could do a supination action, and that would, if you resist it sufficiently, you will get an interesting activation pattern in the elbow flexors that you're not going to see in a elbow flexion motion. But just to be clear, I don't think that the data support it being something that we can name. But again, coming back to this idea of, naming stuff and nomenclature, we give names to muscles, but the body doesn't see things in the same way. So, we go, we're going to call this the biceps, kind of brachii short head, and that's the long head, and then you expect to see that the brain will kind of use the short head for one purpose and the long head for another purpose, and it doesn't do, not in everybody, it doesn't do that. So like in some people, you might find the short head does more of supination or more of elbow flexion, or the long head might do that instead. Alternatively, in many people, what you actually see is that there's a certain distribution of activation within each of those heads of the biceps brachii. Again, one section in both muscles does supination, another section in both muscles does elbow flexion. And it's like, okay, so the brain doesn't see the individual muscles as being a definitive description of what does what. It just picks whatever motor unit does what thing. And if it happens to cross over a boundary between two adjacent muscles in a group, then who cares? Because the brain doesn't think in terms of muscles, it thinks in terms of motor units. So we give anatomy very specific names, and we expect those muscles to then follow our patterns. It's quite arrogant, really, of us. It's like the body doesn't listen to us at all. And it's like, no, I'm just going to go ahead and use whatever works.
So what's the implication for this with the weekly net stimulus? What do you do if you, like you said, if you're using a program that had one exercise per muscle, that'd be quite easy. If you're repeating that exercise multiple times a week, then you just plug that into the weekly net stimulus. If you were using an exercise once per week, say you're doing full body and you're doing 2 sessions a week, AB, and you've got one chest exercise on one workout, another chest exercise on the other workout. So both exercises are done once per week. Like, obviously, there's not a way to correct that in the weekly net stimulus calculator.
Let me give an example of how, let me give an extreme example to start with, and then we'll work backwards to slightly more graded, area example. So imagine that and a famous argument that was had a few months back, and it kind of died away as people who were arguing about it realized it wasn't really something you could argue about, is that somebody might have been programming knee extensions on one of their full body days or one of their lower body days, and then a squat or a leg press pattern on the other day. Now, in this scenario, because the quads are actually pretty vanilla, what you could do is say that your leg press, your knee extension are mostly comparable regarding the single joint quadriceps. Now, I would argue that there's going to be variables that affect whether that's true or not. If you said you're doing single leg press and 2-leg knee extension, I would say they're almost identical as far as the single joint quadriceps are concerned, because your total muscle mass is not really that different in that scenario. So you probably are about as comparable as you're ever going to get between 2 exercises. At least as far as hypertrophy is concerned. If you want to start talking about sarcomerogenesis, that's a separate question. But
which a weekly net stimulus does not account for.
No, but we can talk about that, and you can cover it as long as you are ignoring any sarcomerogenesis caused by static stretching. You can actually do a model for that if you want to do. It's just the weekly net stimulus model is not explicitly designed to address sarcomerogenesis, because in trained lifters it really isn't a big a deal. But if you were to start with this example, and you would say you got 2 workouts a week with sort of a single leg press and a knee extension of 2 legs, similar muscle mass, your single joint quadriceps are probably getting a very similar stimulus across those 2. The erect fem is only being trained in the knee extension. And that's a really kind of useful way, I think, to model how this is working, because when you were then doing your analysis in your the work you were doing to look at the program, you would say erect fem is getting trained once a week.
Yep.
For 3 sets, which is maintenance, which is nothing. And then your leg press and your knee extension together are training your quadriceps, single joint quadriceps, twice a week, and therefore you're getting a kind of ongoing growth net stimulus across the week. So that would be the easiest way of doing it or seeing it.
Yeah.
In that scenario. If you were to say, okay, let's do a slightly harder example, not too much more difficult, but a slightly harder example. Imagine I'm doing bench press in a wide grip, and then on a separate day, I then go to do bench press in a narrow grip. What's happening there with the pec? So in that scenario, in my wide grip bench, I'm probably hitting all 3 regions of the pec. Now I'm steering activation towards the middle region of the 3, a sternal, but I'm definitely also hitting clavicular really well and costal pretty well as well. If I then go to the narrow grip, which is explicitly designed to target the clavicular more, I'm now doing a shoulder flexion exercise, which is essentially antagonist to the basic function of the costal pec. So I lose one region of the pec straight away. So again, in the same scenario, if you were looking at that and going, I'm doing 2 exercises for my bench, but I'm doing 1 narrow grip and 1 wide grip, I'm going to say, okay, well, I'm going to treat my wide grip bench as being very good but not perfect, training all 3 regions, and I'm going to treat my my narrow grip bench, which might have an incline if people want to do that, as being very, very good, if not perfect, at clavicular pec development as within the context of the exercises that I'm doing. Again, pretty good probably at sternal, and utterly useless, if not zero impact on cost or pec. So again, that would be an example you could kind of look at from that perspective. And you can just keep going.
You could do it with the opposite. You could do it with a pullover then as well. You have the same issue, but the opposite.
You would get sternal pec where you weren't getting, not sternal. You get costal pec where you were not getting anything else. So you could kind of fill that gap as regards the muscle that you weren't training. So you can keep going in this direction and get more and more grey. So you can go, okay, well, what happens if I'm now looking at the frontal plane versus sagittal plane, lat pull downs? So now, it's like a lot of people really, really resist the idea that, there's muscle fibers in the thoracic lat that aren't getting trained in wide grip pull downs. I'm like, my friend, the existence of voluntary activation deficits mean that some muscle fibers must get left out.
Yeah.
Which ones is it going to be? It can't be the same ones. So which ones is it going to be? It's going to be different ones. So you can't actually and again, people are ignoring the voluntary activation literature, or they're trying to minimize it. And I'm like, okay, so why does the bilateral force deficit exist then if we don't have a voluntary activation deficit that varies according to things like muscle mass usage, or how are we seeing different patterns of muscle activation in maximal effort situations when I'm doing different things with the biceps brachii? It's literally just ignoring physiology. So, but yeah, lat is a great example of something that moves you even more in that grey direction where you're like, is this, am I getting anything clear cut happening here, or is it just a blend? And it's more of a blend. I'm losing some muscle fibers, but I can't be clear about why that's happening. It's just because of the voluntary activation deficit. It's not because the muscle has an antagonist.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful to start with those extreme examples, because there is, I am seeing some people online think that if a muscle is active, then the entire muscle is active. And, obviously there's examples there where that's fundamentally impossible. And, obviously you talked about direct fem, but
it's fundamentally impossible, full stop. I mean, you can't fully activate a muscle. You'd have to hook yourself up to a machine to be able to do that. You can't do it. Unless you're talking about hand muscles, you can't get maximal activation of anything, especially not in a strength training context.
Yeah. So the idea it doesn't hold water at all. I mean, when I saw people start to talk about this again a little bit more recently, I thought, well, based on that idea, if you think that anything that's being used is being maximally used, like you may as well just do like a front raise. Like that's going to be such an amazing chest exercise, shoulder exercise. But like, how could that possibly be a good chest exercise? 2/3 of the chest.
Yeah, exactly. If you extrapolate the arguments of people who think that you can maximally activate muscles in any exercise they're doing, if you maximally extrapolate what they're saying, you would literally only have to do one press, one pull, one like squat, and one sort of hip hinge or something like that, and you would not need to do anything else at all. And that is just not how bodybuilding works. It's like,
it poses the question, why would you change exercises?
Exactly. But don't get me wrong, though. I mean, like, if somebody is doing a one press, one pull, one squat, one hip hinge, that is like a million times better than doing nothing.
Yes.
It's like, just to be clear, like, you can go a long way with that, but you are not going to be getting up on stage looking like anything reasonable if you just do that. I think that's just the important thing that we need to recognize. Bodybuilding as a sport really benefits massively from exercise variety.
Yes. Obviously all of this is in the context of what that individual's goals are, what their needs are. I mean, I've made this point before. Exactly. I don't program rec fem work for everyone. Some people don't even want that aesthetic, so I'm not going to give it to them.
Exactly. And as I said at the beginning, I make compromises. I start with knowing what I think the perfect program would look like, and then I chop like 25% of it out because I don't want to be in the gym doing a ton of work, devoting my energy to something when I've got other things that I want to do instead. It's everyone's going to have a cutoff point, and I think what we're going to start with is by saying, what is the physiology? And then you take a very, very small step back from that and go, okay, how can I make competition, bodybuilding programs that maximize the usage of that physiology? Because that's what this is all about, isn't it? It's like you start with the physiology and go, this is reality. Take a small step back from that and go, this is what bodybuilding competition preparation would ideally require. And then you take another step back and go, Okay, but for somebody who doesn't want to step on stage but still wants to look really, really good, kind of compromise a little bit more, and then you just keep taking additional steps until you get eventually down to someone like me who's old and just wants to kind of maintain, which is, sort of strength and sizes we've managed to hang on to. But the point is, everyone's going to have their own point in that spectrum where they say that's the right zone for me, but it doesn't change the way the physiology works. And I think I'm seeing a lot of people figure out where they want to be on that spectrum and then try and argue that nothing else matters, which is really disingenuous. It's like, no, accept reality to start with and stop making excuses up for why you want to train in a different way from the way that is perfect. Because ultimately, that's what it's all about. You've got these creators who are running around going, I train like this, I program like this, therefore it's the most perfect way in the world to program, and anybody who does anything different is wrong. And I'm like, yeah, but physiologically, what you're saying is nonsense. Sure, it's a good way to train for the group of people that you're servicing as a market, but it's a compromise from the actual physiological reality.
Yep. Yeah, that's a really good point. I hope people listen to that. And it sort of ties into what we said earlier. There's going to be other variables, sure, but we can't pretend that those other factors and other variables are influencing the physiology. They're not. Like the physiology is a basis and a foundation. You use that, and then you decide, okay, what are the things I have to give here for this particular person?
It just reminds me of the people who kind of, like you said there, the people who will arrive in and say, yes, but I understand what you're saying about neuromechanical matching, or I understand what you're saying about exercise selection, but I don't like those exercises. I like these exercises, which are more motivating to me, and I think that being more motivating to me is going to make them better. And I'm like, it will give you a higher recruitment level. Yes, it will. And if it helps you with adherence and going to the gym, fantastic. And if that's your compromise solution, great. I'm happy for you. But you can't make a glute exercise do kind of biceps work. And if you just keep starting from that ridiculous example and just kind of step by step work your way through the chain, you'll find that, again, you can't make a squat train the rec fem. You can't make, kind of the bits of the biceps that do elbow flexion do supination. You can't make the bits of the lats that do frontal plane work do sagittal plane work. They're just not going to do that, no matter how much you are motivated to do those other exercises.
You can love curls all you want, but it's not going to work your glutes.
Exactly. And you just kind of start with the absurd example and work your way down to the more grey area examples, and you'll see how this works. It's just harder to see the closer you get to the muscle fibers being, similar to each other in function rather than further away from each other in function. So, yeah, I mean, like, as I say, if somebody has a program that they're really motivated to follow, I'm not criticizing them, I'm not suggesting that they stop doing that. All I'm saying is, just try and let go of your ego and accept that reality isn't perfect, or at least it doesn't map perfectly onto the thing that you're doing. And there may be better solutions out there for people who are more motivated than you to succeed in the goal rather than just enjoy themselves in the gym.
Yeah. It's okay that someone's choosing to do something which is not physiologically perfect.
Totally. Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, this is the crazy thing. It's like, what happens is I think in the fitness industry, creators blend those two questions together. They're always trying to say, what I want to do has to be physiologically perfect. And they're never able to separate those two things apart and go, I'm choosing not to program in a way that is physical. It's almost like they can't be intellectually honest. It's like what they should do, really, if they wanted to be intellectually honest, is to say, yes, physiology works like this. No, I don't recommend training in a way that maximizes that physiology or physiological reality because of these reasons.
Yes.
And I take these compromises because they help with adherence, they help with enjoyment, they mean that I'm not in the gym for 3 hours a day, and all these other benefits that they have identified, probably perfect, validly, and they could market on that basis, and they would actually then be coherent and consistent with physiology, and then they wouldn't have to spend, a lot of time getting all upset and, arguing with people on social media about how the physiology works when they haven't read enough studies to actually understand it in the first place.
Yeah. I think that's a really interesting thing there, to actually identify, this is why I'm not doing what's perfect. And sometimes I explain that to my groups because sometimes I will program stuff that's not perfect. And an example here might be that, recently in one of our last phases, I gave people a drop set and I gave them, so a single set, a set of about 5 and then about 30 seconds off, reduce the weight by about 20% and try to match those repetitions a second set of 5. And I was upfront and said, hey, this is not perfect. This is not going to be as stimulating as just taking 2 or 3 minutes off and doing a second set. But this allows us to get a high amount of exercise selection done in about 50 to 60 minutes. If we didn't do that, it would take us, 70, 80, 90 minutes to do the same thing. And a lot of people in that group didn't have time to do that. So this is why I'm making that compromise. Is it physiologically perfect? No, but I've made the smallest compromise I think I can make to achieve this other purpose. So I actually think that's quite an interesting conversation for people to have.
Absolutely. And the silly thing is that a lot of the creators out there at the moment who are burning time, energy, and credibility on arguing about physiological stuff that they don't really understand, they could actually provide enormous amounts of value by going down that road instead of, some of my favorite creators, and many of them have actually been through the mentorship program before, and they've gone on and built on the knowledge that they've gathered through that process. And they've gone on, and a lot of them now primarily help people solve practical issues associated with these kind of programs, like exactly the way you've described. And they make compromises and they go, this is how it works, but I'm doing this because of these practical reasons. And I think that's fantastic to see. And I really enjoy, looking at what they're doing, what they're creating in that respect. There's a number of ways that people can actually add value, I think, in the industry at the moment, as creators, rather than trying to compete with me, which is just really, really silly. Honestly, it's really silly because I've been doing this a very, very long time and I've read a lot more studies than pretty much anybody else out there, if not everybody else out there. So it's just not going to happen if they think they're going to compete with me on that. But they could actually do some really interesting stuff that doesn't compete with me. And I'm not asking people not to compete with me. I just find it quite funny. But, just for their sake, I think it would be interesting for them to consider that.
Yeah, I think it would add more value as well. There's a quote, I think maybe Oscar Mira, I think it was him, and he talks about this idea that he doesn't want to be anti anyone. Like his mission is to be showing sort of a new option of what's better. And I think as soon as we get caught up being anti people and trying to take down someone and trying to compete for the sake of competing, it lessens or reduces the ability for us to actually be putting out something that's creative and constructive and a better narrative or a better idea for people. And, if people are simply focused on, hey, how do I take down this individual? It's like, well, you're just robbing yourself and your audience of potentially adding value.
In this particular instance, it's a fool's errand anyway. I really don't see what they're going to make out of it. But, everyone's got their own choices to make. But it's just, as I say, I think there's an interesting, ego trap here where people are falling into this belief that they feel like their way of training has to be physiologically perfect in order for it to have value, and it doesn't.
Yeah. I love seeing people say stuff like, I choose to do this because, not because it's the most physiologically perfect thing, but because I enjoy it or it works because of X or whatever. I find those conversations so refreshing. And do you know what it allows? It allows people we would look at the weekly limit stimulus and say, well, anyone who plays with it is going to see there's one clear outcome here of what seems to be best on paper. Sure. There's no two ways about it. And it allows us to have a conversation. Hey, if you don't want to train like that, that's great. You've told me why. And that's cool. That's fine. I have no issue with anyone doing that.
I've said before, there's times where I will do 2 full body sessions a week.
Yeah.
Now, that's miles away. And my exercise selection is probably pretty thin.
Yeah.
Is that miles away from what many in the science-based lifting community are doing with, dozens of exercises and, training every other day and all that kind of thing. And it's just because my requirements are different from theirs. I have a lower priority invested in those outcomes. Got other stuff I want to do. And it's not as important to me to achieve the things that they want to achieve. So, again, it's like if people were able to get out of the ego trap and stop having to argue that their program has to be the most physiologically perfect program, and instead go, my program solves this, or my program solves this problem for this group of people, who have these requirements, and these are the compromises I like to make that work for them. The physiology says this, but we do these things because it makes their life easier. It makes it easier to adhere to the program. We can get in and out of the gym more quickly, blah, 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 blah. Then fantastic. Everyone's happy. No one's arguing. But I think there's this ego trap at the moment where everyone is heavily invested in making sure that they can turn to the camera and say, my way of programming is perfect, and therefore, it has to agree with physiology. And then they end up twisting the physiology to fit the programming rather than the other way around. And that's what we're seeing happening a lot. People are going, muscles don't atrophy between workouts, or this, and we clearly got the maintenance literature showing that they do. Or go, the squat trains the rec fem, when you've clearly got data showing that it doesn't. Or they'll go, there's no difference between the lat pull downs in the frontal plane and the sagittal plane, when you've got 3 EMG studies and a bunch of moment arm studies showing that they do. And it's just like, they're literally just saying that because they want to defend their way of programming. It's like, no, just come on, a bit of intellectual honesty, get out of the ego trap, and you'd actually find that you won't be in a situation where you've got people yelling at you online because you're kind of saying things that are just blatantly not true. And then they turn around and whine to the camera that, social media is a toxic place. I'm like, well, yeah, but you contributed, didn't you?
It'd be an interesting activity for someone to do, is sit down and reflect on, why have I chosen a program this way? Because if you...
I don't think introspection comes naturally to a lot of creators.
Well, here's someone's invitation to do so. Because if someone is selecting to program in a way because they've got an emotional attachment to it, or, for whatever these other factors are, again, we're not saying that's wrong, but see if you can identify what they are.
I'm laughing because this is a really wonderful kind of illustration of how behind the scenes, Jake is the optimist about human nature and I'm the pessimist. So Jake is always like, yeah, but people will be good and they'll do these things and it'll all be wonderful. I'm like, are you joking? Are you living on the same planet? I'm like...
I found this process helpful for me when I was programming and I was going through some of this content, because there's ways that I enjoy training. And what I found was I was able to make some compromises where I was like, I'm getting rid of this stuff that I cannot justify physiologically. There's this stuff which doesn't make perfect sense, but it doesn't really violate it too badly and I enjoy it. And it allowed me to kind of bridge the gap initially, because what I always thought I enjoyed is not at all what made sense physiologically. Like, now that I understand the physiology, right? So I think it's a valuable experience to have for me. And maybe for some others, and you can disagree with me on that one.
I'm not disagreeing with you that it's valuable. I'm just disagreeing with you that many people will pay any attention to you whatsoever. But that's probably enough preaching for today. I think we've gone way off the end of our remit here on this podcast.
Well, I do actually still have 1 or 2 questions. So one was... one's an observation, I suppose. And for anyone who does go and play with the weekly net stimulus calculator, you will see, if you were to plug in, say, some of the silver era plans we've talked about, what you will notice is they kind of match up pretty much perfectly with what seems to be the best outcome in the calculator. And that, that was, I guess, a huge motivation behind us even doing this podcast in the first place. Yeah. And obviously, one feature you will see in those programs is that they do repeat the same exercises. And so that combats this whole issue we've been talking about today in terms of muscle fiber specificity. So one point I wanted to make there. Now, a question I know...
Also, rather than adding extra sets of the same exercise, they would be much more likely to add a different exercise for the same muscle. So again, you would be playing directly into that line of muscle fiber hypertrophy being a specific phenomenon to each fiber. So it's not just about the same exercise 3 times a week. It's about the fact that even on the volume side of things, rather than adding more sets, they would almost always add extra exercises instead. I think it's really cool.
Yes. Yeah. And we obviously see this sort of upper cap to set number. Generally, that sort of 3rd set is where most people will cap it, which again, if you look at the volume, I don't know if on the calculator, you'd have to select like 1 set, 2 sets, 3, and compare the different numbers it gives you. But you'll see that obviously we've got this diminishing returns in terms of set volume, and arguably that, 2nd or 3rd set is maybe beyond that. You're not really getting much more really from a set by set basis. Now, the question I want to ask is, people who do go and play with this calculator and they get these arbitrary units of hypertrophy at the end of it, they're going to say, well, hang on, if I put this in and it gives me, I forget what numbers are normal, let's say 4, I forget now, it's been a while since I've looked at it, but let's say it gives me 4 units over the week, and I put this workout in and it gives me 2 units, why would I not be growing double the amount of muscle, double the pace in this first workout? And doesn't work like that. But why? Can you explain that?
Yeah. So ultimately, it's because we're using disparate data from different sources to combine to create a model that gives us an idea of what's going on. And those data sources were never really designed or intended to be used together in that way. So, while I've tried to mitigate that by sticking with set effects. So when you look at the volume literature, dose response literature, you're always talking about what does one set do, what does two sets do, what does three sets do. And then you look at the maintenance literature and you go, 3 or 4 sets once per week, how much hypertrophy is stimulated by 3 or 4 sets once per week. And then you kind of work. So it's all based on what a set is capable of doing. Even so, those data sources weren't ever really designed to be collected together, and you always can have a little bit of kind of disjointedness when you combine them. So for me, the weekly net stimulus model is designed to give you a directional indication of whether something is better than something else.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it's going to give you a quantitative, well, it is literally, I mean, by definition, it's giving you a quantitative answer because it's giving you a number. But I think when you're comparing stuff, it is ranking, it's giving you a ranking of outputs. I don't think I would interpret those as magnitude, of effect. It's just saying if you have two workouts and one has a higher ranking than the other, then that one's going to beat the other one. So I'd see it as a ranking effect rather than a magnitude effect. But you're absolutely right. If you put sort of like body part splits in the program, you get nonsense out because it gives you, like half a stimulating rep per week. Not half a stimulating rep per week, half an arbitrary unit per week. Whereas if you put the same kind of exercises in and set some reps in for full body, it'll give you 4 or 5 arbitrary units a week, and it'd be 10 times better. And that's definitely true. Even if you account for the fact that the body part split probably has horrible muscle swelling going on, it probably still isn't, 10% of the effect of a full body program. So it's a ranking effect. It's not a magnitude effect. So, of course, some people are going to go, okay, we can throw it out the window because it doesn't do what I wanted it to do. Well, okay, fine. But it's doing what I wanted to do, which is rank programs in order of effectiveness, which it does really well.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's essentially what a model is doing, isn't it? Like, it's not a perfect representation of reality.
It's just
an abstraction.
Magnitude-based effect. It's not telling you how big the effect is. It's telling you how different the programs are. Yeah. So is it ranking them in order? And it does that using a quantitative method. But, that number that it gives you isn't an indication of how much hypertrophy is happening. It's just an indication of whether one program is better than another. It's a ranking effect.
Yeah.
So you find that 3 times a week is better than 2, and 2 times a week is better than 1, and which is exactly what the long-term data say. We did a whole episode on training frequency, and explained why that data pretty much have to be consistent with the explanation that higher frequencies are better than lower frequencies. But ultimately, the weekly net stimulus model gives you that answer without being told to, which I think is really cool. So the thing I like most about the weekly net stimulus model is that you start with 3 sources of data, or 3 assumptions, which are really difficult to argue with. It's really difficult to argue with the dose response of hypertrophy on a workout by workout basis. And we've got a physiological explanation for why it's nonlinear, and we've got numerical training data showing that it's nonlinear. You then put that next to the maintenance literature, which again is impossible to argue with, shows you that you've got atrophy happening within a week, and you put that next to the stimulus period duration, which you can argue a little bit with, but it's probably ballpark figure 36 to 48 hours. And you put those 3 pieces of information in the model, and it spits out the answer, which just so happens to be exactly the way that Silver era bodybuilders have always trained, which is extraordinarily coincidental. And it also kind of fits with, as I say, the interpretation that we can get from long-term frequency studies, which again, ranking order, 3 is better than 2, 2 is better than 1. And so you put all of that together and you go this is fairly straightforward. It's just all nicely kind of aligned. So that's probably about as good as we can do at the moment. Yeah, we'd love to have better data, but we just don't have it.
And obviously the podcasts we've done over the last few weeks, we've talked about, sleep deprivation and stress and calorie deficit and these things that will influence that end number in the calculator. It won't necessarily influence which which option or which split or whatever is going to be the most effective option there. But obviously all those things will play into, potentially the stimulus period or the atrophy period or all those kind of variables as well. And, again, one we haven't really talked about in detail yet is anabolics, and that will influence some of that as well. For example, maybe the maintenance stuff. But it's not going to necessarily change which situation or scenario is going to be the most effective still on paper.
Yeah. That's probably a conversation for another day. I do think that glucocorticoids especially probably just create a background problem effect. I don't think they change how we approach training that much. You might want to change recovery. Because it would change recovery, you might want to change volumes a little bit to make sure.
Well, let me ask you this. Is there any scenario you can think of? So at the moment, if you had no other sort of existing issues and you went to the model or the calculator, what it's going to come out with is ultimately full body every other day or 3 times a week is going to be superior. Is there a scenario you can think of?
No. There's nothing that I can think of There's nothing I can think of that would change the ideal training program that would create the best output. You might find that you have more constraints in what you can put into the model in the first place.
Yep.
Which I think is probably going to be the conversation for next week with anabolics. Yep. But I don't think anything would change how the body responds to the stimulus side of things. As I say, with glucocorticoids, you might find that you have to limit the data in terms of how many sets you can recover from per workout. So you're limiting what data you can put in.
Yes. Yeah.
But the model itself won't change.
Yes.
And I think the same thing applies to anabolics, actually. We might find we limit what data you're allowed to put in and still remain healthy. But I don't think you can, simply, I don't think it's going to change the output the model gives you. No, I don't.
Yeah. Well, that's a conversation for next week.
The training stimulus does sit parallel to all of this other stuff. So what the training is doing in terms of stimulus is sitting parallel to both glucocorticoid and anabolic hormone effects. So I don't think it changes anything on that score. It just changes what we can put in the first place, I think. Yeah.
Okay, so people, where can they find this? So if you just jump on Google and you Google weekly net stimulus calculator, I think it'll probably come up.
Yeah, I have a pinned post on my Instagram, and there is a link in my bio to the calculator. So if you've found me on Instagram, then you've found the weekly net stimulus model.
Perfect. Well, thank you everyone for joining us for another episode, and I hope you'll join us again next week as we probably talk about anabolics, which will be a fun conversation. So join us, and thank you as always.